Um, and so our guest today is David Shor. David is an American data scientist who elects Democrats very successfully, elected Barack Obama. So it doesn't get much bigger than that. He's known for analyzing political polls and is the head of data science with OpenLabs, which is his own business, which is just fantastic. So they're a progressive nonprofit. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. So a real honor and pleasure to be joined by David today. And so thank you very much, David.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And let me just share my screen. This is gonna partially be about data science, but also mostly about politics. I think it's reasonably apolitical in a sense, but I hope you don't mind too much. And I appreciate the invite and opportunity to speak to you all. It's kind of crazy how many, there are way more of you here than I thought there'd be. So I'm going to talk about data science and U.S. politics, and kind of basically the work that me and my team have been working on for the last couple of years. So first, just a little bit about our team. We were founded by folks who came out of the Obama 2012 analytics team, which was covered probably more than it should have been in the US press, and it was kind of known as the cave because they shoved 50 people inside a small broom closet and kept us there for about a year. So basically, our clients were kind of like, I think in some ways, like the measurement nucleus of the Democratic Party. We worked with nearly every 2020 presidential campaign, which was very awkward. Let me be clear. Every major 2020 Democratic presidential campaign, we obviously didn't work with Trump. It was very awkward having to work for Warren and Bernie and Biden at the same time because they didn't like each other very much. We work with most of the committees and super PACs, most of the outside groups like labor unions. But for this audience, we also had a very close relationship with the Liberal Party of Canada in 2015. Which may or may not be popular. It's probably actually not maybe super popular in this particular group, maybe split. But that was something that we did that was fun and interesting. I know way more. I know what words like Etobicoke means, or all the different pieces of St. John knowledge I don't get to use very often anymore. All right, so in terms of focus areas, we do election forecasting, we do resource allocation. We try to figure out, we predict elections, we try to figure out how much do you spend in different places. We build lots of predictive models of everyone in the country to figure out their chance of voting, their chance of being a Democrat. And then most importantly, we do an enormous amount of content testing, figure out what ads are effective, what messages are effective. And so, we, in 2020, we conducted, I think 7,000 RCTs on about roughly 7 million people, or more accurately, 7 million interviews, probably like 2 or 3 million people. We allocated hundreds of millions of dollars in ad spend. We generated forecasts for every single race up and down the ballot. Some of them were more accurate than others. And our team's about 17 machine learning software engineers, mostly in New York, though in the age of COVID, folks have scattered throughout the world. So just to kind of talk high level about the big problems in politics, or kind of our boring and unromantic view of politics, is that, the day-to-day of a campaign, kind of breaks down to 3 basic questions. What races are close? Where should I spend my money? Once you decide what races are close, what do you actually talk about? And that could take a couple different forms. It's like, what ads do you put on the air? What issues do you run on? What talking points do you feed to the press? And then the third thing is, once you decide what you want to talk about and where you want to spend your money, you have to actually spend the money. So there's a lot of targeting questions. What TV shows do you buy? What people do you send mail to? And a lot of that. And so, our team kind of came about after the 2016 elections, because Donald Trump won. That was very, like I think most of the world, I was very sad about that. And I think, but I was sad not just because it was horrible for the world, but also because I've been working in politics for like 4 years, and I felt like we had been kind of wasting our time. That there was a lot of that the industry had basically focused on like really easy to quantify problems, like estimating someone's probability of voting, making it like 1% better, and like really just kind of shied away from like the real struggles that we had, like how do you confront authoritarianism. And so anyway, just to go through some of these things that were broken at the time, in 2016, all the polls were wrong in the US, which is why everyone was surprised that Donald Trump was wrong and it won. And the reason is that way fewer people answer surveys, and traditional survey science doesn't really work anymore. In order, what you decide to talk about is like the single most important thing. And historically, campaigns would do that based on getting like 4 or 5 very strange people in a room and showing them videos and asking them what they think, which is probably not the right way to do that, given that the future of the free world is at stake. And then on top of that, basically and this was an Obama era failure. In campaigns, people really prioritized knocking on doors and field. And the world has really changed a lot in the last 10 years. It turns out there are a lot of ways to reach people that don't involve, spamming them. And so that's something we had to think about. So just to go through this this plot over here, because I want to bring myself back to a happy place. What this is showing is net spending per electoral vote. So the basic idea is red bars mean that Trump spent more, and blue bars mean that Clinton spent more. And this is going by state, and they're ordered in terms of closeness. And so what you could see is that in the tipping point state, that actually decided that put Trump over 270 electoral votes, that was Wisconsin. Trump outspent Clinton, by about 4 to 1. And that's despite Hillary Clinton having raised about 3 times more than Trump did overall. So very bad analytics failure. And, I think it just kind of goes to show, these kind of minor technical decisions, can sometimes end up being very important. And, just in terms of why this happened, it just turns out very few people answer phone surveys in the US anymore. It's actually not as bad in other countries, but, when I started, it was about 12% of people would pick up the phone. Now it's 1%. That's too low. At that point, the people who take these surveys are very weird, and it ends up, getting you to the wrong conclusions. And I think it's funny because I actually made this slide right before the election, where I was saying, polling it's still broken, and this was showing how basically state by state, the polling errors were basically the same in 2018 as they were in 2016. And what's funny is, then the polls were wrong again in 2020. So it's still the way that public pollsters do polls really doesn't work. So now I'm going to move on to the message testing. So, after ahead of 2018, we kind of built a way to actually test advertisements doing randomized controlled trials. The idea, some people, you ask them some covariates, you ask them who they're voting for, they don't see the ad. Other people see the ad, they don't even know they're part of an experiment, see the ad, and you survey them afterward. And so it's an actual infield, randomized controlled trial for advertisements. And so we've tested on the order at this point, like thousands of these ads. And what we found is that roughly 20% of the ads that the Democratic Party makes people want to vote for Republicans. And so we, I think people talk about different theories of change in politics. And one underrated one is let's find those ads and not spend money on them and not show them to people. And so that's like a big part of what we do. And I think what's really interesting is that the ads, like when we look at what these ads are, sometimes it's obvious they're like poorly produced or, or they have terrible sound or whatever. But a lot of the times it's the ads that people in the office actually like the most. In fact, like the more people like the ads, the worse they do. And, I think the reason for that is just that, people who work in democratic and progressive politics are all, young, highly educated, they live in cities, and they're very different than the kinds of people that we're trying to persuade. And also, to be clear, the kind of people that we need to motivate to vote. And so, I think that's one of the things I really like about the kind of work that we do is it kind of allows us to step outside of these biases, obviously that, we all have. Obviously, you can't do that in totality, but every little bit helps. So just to talk a little bit about the actual data piece of what we do with some boxes, the basic idea is that we do a ton of surveys. I think that we're in the top 5 purchaser of online surveys in the US. We did roughly 7 million interviews in 2020. So we survey a ton of people. And we also have voter files, which also exist in Canada, though they are a lot messier, which are basically these big lists of almost everyone in the country and some basic information about them, where they live, their gender, how old they are, and then there's unfortunately creepy external commercial appends that you can buy, like whether or not they used to subscribe to AOL, or I don't know how much they spend on credit cards, though that's bucketed into 10 buckets. It's not as juicy as you might think. And then we have a bunch of first party data from political campaigns. So basically in the US, people have been knocking on doors and trying to get people to vote for folks really for the last, it's forever, but there's a big giant database that really goes back to 1988. There's actually 100,000 Michael Dukakis IDs in Minnesota where it's still just recorded. And so that, it actually adds up. There's been, if I remember correctly, roughly 185 million people in the US, out of 330 million or 350 million have been interviewed by, a Democratic campaign volunteer at some point in the last 40 years. And so that data is all there. And, the basic idea is that we do the surveys, we join to all the data, we fit the model, and then we score the file. And just to go through, largest models have 1.5 million rows. The commercial files have approximately 300 million rows. So just, talk through, this gets into a more statistics heavy thing. Why is this really hard? Politics has a lot of structure. You could even, maybe call it intersectional. There's just really a lot of complex factors, socioeconomic class, religion, ethnicity, education, income, all of these are tied together, but also different in ways that are important. And the ways that they influence things like ideology or partisanship can also be different. And the relative salience of these factors, what drives behavior and what drives choices can change from election to election. And important surveys, even if you're surveying millions of people, it turns out you need to cut things up by district, by week. This all actually becomes very tricky. The second problem is bigger. Is that we have super biased data. Survey takers are really weird. I really can't stress how strange. And to be clear, God bless them. I'm glad that they're taking our surveys. But if you, with phones, for example, if only 1% of people, are answering surveys, answering surveys itself kind of becomes an inherently political act. One of my favorite statistics is in the U.S. 90% of people who answer surveys vote. Among people who say they're definitely not going to vote, 80% of those people vote. And so it's a hard problem. And the other thing is just, our business decisions. We're building these models to figure out how close different congressional districts are going to be. And if we get some interaction in West Virginia wrong, we'll misallocate, millions of dollars. And then the other thing that's very annoying is that, we're trying to measure changes over time. And unlike in Canada, public opinion doesn't move very much. Just to give you some numbers, Barack Obama in 2012 got 52% of the vote. Hillary Clinton got 51.1. Joe Biden got 52.3. It's really since 2004, every American political election has really been in a literal 1.5% range. But who wins? Actually, all these little changes can really make a very big difference. The difference between Donald Trump or Barack Obama or Joe Biden. But measuring small things is annoying and hard. All right. So one of the big ways in which survey takers are weird, and this is what we think is one of the big drivers between polling error in 2016, 2018, 2020, is this concept of social trust. So, basically, you ask people, do you think that people can generally be trusted? Do you think that people should keep to themselves? And for what it's worth, it used to be that 60% of people said that people could be trusted going back to the 1970s. And now that number is more like 35%. And that's it's dropping at about 1% per year. That's probably very concerning, though that's a little bit above my pay grade. But one of the measurement implications of all of this is that people who say that they can trust the people around them, they trust the people around them, unsurprisingly, are way more likely to answer phone surveys. You just think about what's happening. If you don't trust institutions and you hate your neighbors and someone calls you, you're going to hang up. It's just not going to work. So it means that all of the surveys that we're looking at, and this has been true for a very long time, there's evidence of this going back to the 70s. That means that all the research that we do and it's true here, it's almost certainly true in Canada and elsewhere in the world, really oversamples this like, you know, conscientious, you know, trusting group of people that like care about institutions, and like undersample the kind of people who like, I don't know, vote for Rob Ford or, you know, whatever. And like, so going to this, just to show this in numbers, like what changed in 2016? Why did the polls suddenly start being wrong in 2016? And the answer is that it used to be that whether or not you trusted the people around you just wasn't that correlated with who you voted for. There were, you know, conspiracy theory Democrats and, you know, like trusting Republicans, but Donald Trump like changed what it meant to be a Democrat or a Republican. And suddenly, you know, what was like a referendum on healthcare became this referendum on, you know, whether or not you trust the people around you. And so you can just see this in this slide. I'll finally talk about the slide, which is among people who could be trusted, those people swung toward Clinton. But among people who couldn't be trusted, those people swung away from Clinton. And that's true even within educational category. And so this 9%, this like low trusting group of non-college whites, and it turns out that social trust is actually like very correlated with education for a variety of reasons. They were missed. You know, there was this silent majority of low trust people who turned against Democrats, and they just literally weren't in our surveys. And you know it's funny. Like I think in political tactics, like a lot of my leftist friends will say, you know, the reason Hillary didn't talk about economics was because, you know, she didn't want to enrage her donor base. And I was like, no, I mean, I was there. I mean, it wasn't really the reason it actually happened was that there were these low trust people who probably for whom economic messaging would have worked better than, you know, the Better Together messaging. But they literally didn't answer the phone surveys that she used to pick her messaging. And so just mechanically, you know, we picked the wrong thing. And then Donald Trump ran the US for 4 years, and it was very bad. So it just kind of goes to show like a lot of these minor technical questions in some ways can end up having very big implications. So anyway, just to go a little bit into, I think, the deep interactions in politics. So here, this is just like a fun table that shows some of the complexities about identity and how that intersects with ideology and partisanship. So here, you know, we have race, attitudes toward the Bible, and whether or not you have a college degree. And then we have two-way Clinton percent, and then we have, you know, ideology. And what you can see is that there's a lot of stuff here that isn't linear. So, you know, like one example is if you are a white person who without a college degree, then, you know, going from the least religious category to the most religious category, it makes you 40 points higher. But if you're African American in that situation, going from the highest religious category, you know, to the lowest one is actually associated with a decrease in support. That more like holding everything else constant, religious African Americans are more democratic than you know, secular ones. And you know, and while that's true for partisanship, that is not true for ideology. You know, obviously secular African Americans are more liberal and they're less conservative, but they're also more Republican. And you know, basically, if you dig into it, it has a lot to do with the role of, you know, the Black church and the African American community. But it just kind of goes to show that, you know, American society is very complicated. You know, race, and there are all these different institutions and influences that influence each other in different ways. And it turns out that questions like, you know, it matters a lot what your dependent variable is. Ideology and partisanship are different things that don't always mean the same thing. And so just to give another example, a lot of politics is still local. You know, I remember one of the most fun aspects for me of, you know, my brief stint in Canadian politics was, you know, I think in St. John, I think it was in Labrador, you know, there was this race that I was really obsessed with because there was this guy, Jack Harris, who was an NDP candidate, and then he won. He had this insane swing in 2006 and was kind of like the Jesus Christ of St. John's. You know, he broke all the models and how well he did. And he actually like very narrowly lost that time against this guy, Pat Whalen. And I was trying to understand why. And I was looking at the surveys and there were these open ends and all these people were like, oh, I love the Whalens, you know, it's a great family. And, And it just kind of shows like the equivalent of that in the US, and I probably butchered some of that, so I apologize, is in West Virginia in 20. So here, in basically, I want to just show two states. There were two Senate elections in 2018, one in Florida and one in West Virginia. There were others, but these are the two that are here. And so if you look at party registration, something that's very interesting about West Virginia is it used to be very liberal. It used to be one of the bluest states in the country. But then over the past 30 years has become now one of the most conservative states in the country. And it's like a pretty standard, coal miners turning their, socially conservative coal miners who are liberal on economic issues. Same story, every developed country in the world. But a lot of them are still registered as Democrats, with the government. And so what you could see is among registered Democrats, most of them don't vote for Hillary Clinton anymore. But like this one person who was running, Joe Manchin, he used to be governor. People knew who he was, and so they were just like, "Oh yeah, that guy, he's the Whalen," I guess. And so it's Nick Whalen, not Pat Whalen. My bad. Anyway, so anyway, that's what's interesting is that in Florida there really wasn't that much of a difference between Clinton vote and presidential vote by party reg, but in West Virginia it really mattered a lot. And so when you're doing these models, you have to actually know all of these things in order to produce reasonable estimates. And I'm almost done, I promise. So the next thing is that public opinion in the U.S. is extremely stable. This is our numbers from 2012. Public polls can bounce around a lot, but most of that is sampling error. And throughout the entire 2012 campaign, solid year of my life, it was everything was within literally a 1% range for the entirety of the campaign. There were very few moments that mattered, and that's how public opinion usually works. But sometimes not. Like in this case, this is showing in the Super Tuesday in 2020, estimated Joe Biden support over time. And what happened was over literally a 3-day period from February 29th to March 3rd, there was a South Carolina primary and then there was Super Tuesday. Joe Biden's support went from 22% to 45%. And we surveyed a lot, and it was really breaking our systems in that his support was moving by roughly a third of a point per hour. And very rare in politics. Do you have to? The reason was he got all this media coverage and all these people endorsed him, but you need to simultaneously have a system that can handle this, but then also not break when you have this. And that's something that's very hard. It's usually not like this, but it happens. And when it happens, it really matters. So, we do a lot of work. Something I'm very proud of is, here we show 2018 and 2020 Democratic primary. 2020 general also was pretty good, but we've had roughly 40% of the mean squared error of 538 for about 3 cycles in a row. So, I mean, you'd expect you'd get more from interviewing millions of people, but all the stuff, it does help. So this is like kind of the bragging slide that I like to show. So anyway, just to close out, with some challenges around data stuff that I want to close out on. The first is in our field, one of the big steps I think that I had to work through in this field was in the beginning, I wanted to work on really well-defined problems. Like I'm going to build this supervised learning model. I'm going to try swapping out the random forest with the whatever. And, most of the most important problems, from decision makers are just really vague things. Like, what do we do about Georgia? And, you have to make, you can try to answer these things, but I mean, even when a problem is reasonably defined, like if someone comes to us and says, what Senate candidate should we recruit in Texas? Like the reality is that there's no perfect way to do it. You can't do a randomized controlled trial where you run 6 candidates, you run that election 6 times, and you get a time machine, you go back and you tell them what to do. And so you have to make a lot of leaps. You have to be like, well, this candidate is more popular, or let's run some hypothetical candidate matchups, or like whatever. But if you're not willing to make those leaps, then you'll have decision paralysis, and that will be really bad. And then the last thing is just my personal journey is that when I started working in this field, I was like 20, and I was just like, oh, I know all this Bayesian statistics, and that's how I'm gonna bring about social democracy. And there were these people who were older who had been working in politics for a long time, and we would, the analytics people, we would clash with them a lot. And I remember hating them. Like, oh, people don't know any statistics. What are they doing? And, and looking back on it, I think like looking at all of our disputes, I think like 80% of the time where we disagreed, they were right, and I was wrong. And with a little bit more maturity, I can see that now. But I guess what I'll say, and this has been true, this has been my experience in politics, and I hope I don't lose anti-capitalist cred for saying this. But just like in my experience, it's very hard actually to get to the top of high-profile organizations. Like getting to be the person who like tells Chuck Schumer what to do or whatever is like very hard. And so the people who do that are actually, the people who get to the top are often like really pretty smart, even if they lack a background in statistics or social science. And just ignore them at your peril. I've come to appreciate that, because it's really easy in a data, I don't know, as a data person to forget, I don't know, to not appreciate that there's actually a lot of different kinds of intelligence and wisdom out there. Okay, so with that is my talk. I hope this was not too off topic for you all, or was at least entertaining. Happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, David. That was just wonderful. I just really appreciate that. If people have questions, I'll start off with 2 questions, and then if people have questions, they can just like raise their hand and I'll call on you. But just to get started, so I've put 5 books in the chat that I imagine if you were stuck on a desert island, I imagine these are your 5. I don't know. But can you name a few books that you sort of think that people should read? What are some books that folks should read here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will say, and it's a personal feeling, I should read more books than I do. But I would say the most important thing for me is social science Twitter. There's there's this. I'm gonna say Matt Grossman. Like I think what's hard about a lot of this is that, I mean, Ezra Klein came out with a book very recently about polarization that I think is really good and gets into a lot of social psychology that I think is important. I don't know if I can get to 5, but I would say I would say that The Origins of Mass Opinion, if you're really into politics, I think is useful from a statistics perspective. I really like Bayesian data analysis, like BDA, in Bayesian circles. People call it the Bible sometimes, but that's kind of how I got my start. But I don't know. I honestly, I mainly read a lot of Twitter. I think that there's like a couple of accounts that I find like super useful to help stay on top of what's going on. Matt Grossman is a professor of political science at the University of Michigan. He's extremely good. Alexander Berger, he is the money man for the effective altruists. If you know about them, I'm not going to explain it, but he posts very excellent papers. And same with Otis Reed. And then if you're into politics, Jonathan Robinson. But anyway, so those are Twitter recommendations. But in terms of books, I'd go with those. I should probably read more books than I do, and I apologize for that.
No, that's perfect. In my household, BDA is the Old Testament and statistical rethinking is the New Testament. But yeah. And then the second question, and then we'll get to Vincent and then Gerald, is, best I could tell, you are mostly self-taught in all this stuff. So most folks here are associated with a university in some way or another. What do you wish we did a better job of teaching?
Yeah, I mean, my background, I was a math undergrad, and so that, and then I took like, I'd say maybe like one econometrics class as an elective, which from a statistic was probably the most valuable thing I ever did. So, and then I took a statistics class. I would say going as an employer, as someone who like hires people, I think that kind of the single skill that is probably the most lacking is SQL. That people don't generally get, even in data science programs, people often don't get taught SQL in school. And that's just like a crazy thing to me, because there are very few skills that are like this, where you can really legitimately learn SQL in like 1 day to 2 days, and then reach like a level of like proficiency that is sufficient for many workplaces. So school should probably teach it. But like, I would say the thing that I found most useful, I wish I could remember the name of the book, was I remember there's like some equivalent of BDA for econometrics that I read, as a teenager, where it's like the econ people, there's like this, it's like a big thick green book, but just like there's just I think that a lot of the data science stuff, and this is just, I sound like an old man now, it's like they teach you all these advanced ML methods, but I think just being able to reason through linear regressions really carefully is just like really underrated. Just like think there's just like a lot to know, heteroscedasticity, multicollinearity, like being able to just like work through all of that stuff is useful. And then, yeah, I don't know. I'd say it's really hard to, just because the problem is that the problem with knowledge is that there's so much you could know, but then there's only a small subset of things that you need to do. So it's a hard problem. Educating is pretty hard. But I will say, like looking back, all of the basic probability theory stuff, reasoning through basic reasoning through random variable, if you add normals, I don't know, it's all useful.
Thank you very much. So I'll stop recording here and just say thank you very much to David once again, and then we'll take some questions. So we're going Vincent and then Gerald.